looking at the history of the gospel, and in fact, we could push that history even back before time and space came into existence. So look at these words that Paul spoke to Pastor Timothy. He said that God has saved us and called us to a holy life, not because of anything we have done, but because of his own purpose and grace. And as soon as we hear that phrase, not because of anything we've done, but because of his own purpose and grace, that's what we call the gospel, right? That's the good news, right? That there's this gift that God has given us. Now, when was this gift given to us? The way we would most usually answer this is we would say, well, when Jesus died on the cross, or when I became a child through baptism, or through the Holy Spirit working through the word, creating faith in our heart. Look at the way that Paul describes it. It says, this grace was given us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. Before the beginning of time. So before this world was even created, God was already laying out his plans, we might say. Christ already had sacrificed himself for you and me before time and space began. This was already part of the way that God operated. And we saw how this kind of flows out of his nature, on the one hand of being righteous and just and holy, and on the other hand of also being merciful and loving. So we can say from eternity, we've got a God that already had this plan of redemption. So then we talked a little bit about election. This was our master outline. If you've got the handouts there, this is a big page on the front there, and there's that timeline, that black timeline on the left side there, and then this kind of squiggly thready thing on the right. And that's supposed to kind of illustrate how we've got these promises that God makes slowly throughout history, and how these promises continue to weave into each other and come together ultimately in the cross at the end. But what we're doing is we are starting at the end. So we're starting before Christ. We're starting before the kingdom of Israel, before the people in Exodus, before Abraham. And we started ultimately with Eve. This is what God says to him. I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So right here at the very beginning, we have this promise that there's going to be this he that's going to come, a human male he that's going to in some way be able to crush the head of Satan, defeat Satan. And from that point forward, there's going to be two groups of people in the world, so to speak. There's going to be the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of her. And what do we mean when we talk about the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of her? Well, it's going to all have to do with this promise that we've got here. Cain and Abel were the first children of Adam and Eve, and when Cain and Abel brought their sacrifices to God, we're told that Cain's sacrifice was rejected, whereas Abel's sacrifice was accepted. And out of hatred and anger towards his brother, we've got the first murder, Abel being murdered. And that's the illustration that we have here by this Bouguereau painting. But this is what the writer to the Hebrews says, looking back at this event. Why was it that God accepted Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's? The writer says, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous. So why was his sacrifice accepted in God's eyes? It was because of this faith that was considered righteous by God. So, or commended to him as righteous when God spoke well of his offering. So it did not have to do with the content of the offerings in any way, shape, or form. It had to do with the faith of Abel. Faith in what, though? What was this faith that Abel had? All he had was what Adam and Eve were given in the garden. That there was this promise that the serpent was going to in some way have his head crushed by an offspring. And so that's what Abel put his faith in, along with Eve and the rest of the children of the promise. So after looking at Adam and Eve, we moved then a few thousand years later to Abraham, and we visited this figure named Abram, who God called and brought to a new country, the country of Canaan, and he promised that he was going to give him that country. There was this promise, I'm going to make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And then there was this part at the end, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So what was the actual promise? What was all involved with this promise now that God gave to Abraham? We mentioned this, that Abram was married to Sarai, who was barren, so the two of them couldn't have children. And so part of this promise was that although Sarai was barren, they're going to have a child, and this child will eventually lead to a great nation. Abram's and Sarai's offspring will inherit this land of Canaan that God will lead them to. And all people, somehow the whole world, all nations will be blessed through Abram. And so this promise then is solidified a few other times throughout Abraham's life. God took Abraham outside and said, look up at the heavens and the stars, count them if indeed you can. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. They're going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands and the beaches of the seas. And we've got this interesting phrase then, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So what's going on here? Paul, thousands of years later, reflects back on it, and he says, what then shall we say that Abram, our forefather, discovered in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. So was he loved by God, considered righteous by God because of his works? Paul says, no. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and that was credited to him as righteousness, right? Now, when a man works, his wages are not credited, but a gift. Or when he works, his wages are not credited to him as a gift, but as an obligation. So if you work, you ought to get paid for that work, right? There's an agreement. Is that what happened with Abraham? That he did work and he simply received his wages of righteousness? No, right? It was a gift that was given to him. Well, what was it that Abraham believed in? What was the belief that was credited to him as righteousness? It was that promise that God was going to take his family line, which should have been cut off at that point, was going to turn it into a nation and was going to bless the world through it. That was the content of Abraham's faith. Mingled in that is probably the promise given to Adam and Eve as well, that there was going to be this offspring that was going to crush the head of Satan. But that's all we got at this point. Okay, throughout all of human history up to this point, as far as God's revelation tells us, we've got the promise in the garden. We've got the promise given to Abraham here. There's a few other kind of subtle things that happen after the flood, but there's just very little to talk about at this point. Now we're going to move from Abraham to the next kind of point in history, and we are going to go about 500 years later. Abraham is going to have a son that's going to have a son, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob is going to have 12 sons. Jacob and those 12 sons, they're going to end up in Egypt because of a great famine. And when they move to Egypt, they're going to end up staying there for 400 years. So they're there for a long time. And after that 400 years, even though at the beginning of it, they came and welcomed and were given land and treated well, eventually there's going to be some pharaohs on the throne that end up not liking the Jewish people. And they're going to become enslaved. And 400 years later, we're going to find this nation that had come out of Abraham in Egypt, but as slaves. And that's where we run into this figure named Moses. The children of Israel had moved from Canaan down to Egypt, or at least Jacob and his 12 sons. They were down there for 400 years. They became slaves. And eventually God sent Moses down to Egypt to bring his people out. Moses actually was raised in Egypt, was then had to run away, came back to Egypt, and came back specifically as God's prophet to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. And how did he do that? God used Moses not only to share his words and his message of let my people go, but God also unleashed a number of miraculous events, right? Everything from the way that Moses did things in the court of Pharaoh, staffs turning to snakes and all this kind of business. But then there was the 10 plagues that built up to that crescendo of the 10th plague, the angel of death coming over the land of Egypt and slaying every firstborn that did not have blood over its doorpost. At that point, then, Pharaoh finally relented and let Israel go. At least he relented for a little bit of time, enough for them to get to the Red Sea. And then when the children of Israel, over 1 million of them, I forget the actual number, but as they traveled and they came to the Red Sea, all of a sudden they turn behind them and they see Pharaoh's armies, his chariots coming for them. So Pharaoh had changed his mind. And so that's where we have the episode of the Israelites going through the parted Red Sea, and the Red Sea then falling upon Pharaoh's chariots. And then from that point, they go from the land of Goshen, that is the area that was settled by the Israelites, and they travel down to this mountain called Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai, then, this is the climax of the book of Exodus. So even though we call Exodus, and we probably think more about the time of Egypt and them just physically walking out of Egypt, at the center of the book of Exodus is the mountain. And specifically, when Moses receives the 10 commandments on the mountain. And it's to that we want to spend a little bit of time thinking about. So the Israelites gather around this Mount Sinai, and the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So this is an interesting phrase. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai. What does that mean? In some way, God was making his presence known in time and space there. He was in some way meeting Moses on that mountain. Now, what does it mean for a timeless, spaceless God to meet on a mountaintop? I don't know, but we're going to see the effects of what happens when God does this. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, "Go down and warn the people, so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." Okay. I forget if it's in a bit of the scripture that we're looking at here, but as they gather, it's going to be coming up here. But why do you think we've got this going on? The priests, even the priests who approach the Lord, have to consecrate themselves. What does it mean to consecrate yourself? What does that mean? What's that? Clean yourself, right? Clean yourself and set yourself aside, right? To consecrate yourself through ritual cleanings, right? Why do the priests have to do this? Or the Lord will break out against them. And when we hear those words break out, we mean death. That if the Israelites touch the mountain, if they go close to the mountain when they're not directly instructed by God to do it, then death will be a consequence. Why? Why do you think God being on this mountain, why would approaching him lead to death?
Because they're sinners like we are.
Okay, they're sinners. Why would that lead to death, Jim?
God's a holy God, and he demands perfection.
Yeah, so if God is holy, and when we say holy, and when we say perfect, we mean, and when we say like perfectly righteous and just, that characteristic that we talked about in our very first class, what would a holy and righteous and perfect God, how would a holy, righteous, perfect God feel about being in the presence of unholiness, unrighteousness, and imperfection? He's got to destroy it. He's got to get rid of it. If he doesn't, right, if he tolerates it, then he's no longer holy and righteous, right? On some level, we recognize that to be righteous means you cannot tolerate unrighteousness. To be just means you cannot tolerate injustice. And so in some level, this is being manifested by God's presence on this mountain, right? That you can only approach God on his terms, because if you don't, your own holiness and your own righteousness, this is just a bad recipe, right? The Lord will break out against you. Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." And why is this mountain holy? Because this is now where God is manifesting in some special way. So what happens on this mountaintop? So one of the things that happens you're well familiar with. God spoke these words to Moses as he was up there. "I am the Lord your God. who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet. And what do we call this? Yeah, we call it the 10 Commandments because the Israelites then will call this the 10 Commandments. They'll technically call it the 10 words here, or the 10 phrases, the Decalogue, yeah, right? And so here we've got God specifically telling Israel this list, this moral list of what he requires from them. Now, before God gave the 10 Commandments, was this a complete mystery to humanity? Did we know that it was wrong to murder before the 10 Commandments? Yeah, right. Did we know that it was wrong to commit adultery and to steal? Yeah, right. We might quibble about how to define those terms. Well, what is and what isn't stealing? But virtually every culture throughout all history has recognized these moral laws in some way, shape, or form. So why is God giving these moral laws to the Israelites at this time? Why establish his relationship with them first with this list of commandments? What do you think?
To reinforce his demand for perfection.
Yeah, to reinforce his demand for perfection. Yeah, good.
So they know how to be with him.
Yeah, right. So he is setting the conditions for his relationship with them, right? He is making it as clear as possible, especially now that he's manifesting on this mountain in some way and they're gathering around him. He is saying, this is the starting point for being someone that can be in my presence. And so he lays out then as concretely and as clearly as possible what a holy and righteous God demands. And so these 10 commandments, they apply to all people everywhere. This is step one, so to speak, in how to be in God's presence. Actually, it's step 1 through 10, right? So this is where things start. Now, is this all Moses says on Mount Sinai? No, there's a whole lot more that goes on there. So on Mount Sinai, Moses continually is going up the mountain and down and telling the people everything God says, and up and down, and he's doing this. And there's one time when he's up there for 40 days straight, getting instructions and commands from God. And he gets things such as how to build this thing we call the tabernacle, this very special place where they're going to meet God, where there's this holy place in the middle and then a holy of holies. And what's inside that holy of holies? There's the Ark of the Covenant. And so God gives very specific directions on how he wants them to build this Ark of the Covenant and how this Ark of the Covenant is going to play this role in their religious life. And so he not only gives them then all of these instructions on how to worship him in the tabernacle, he also gives them roles on how to eat, what to eat and what not to eat, and how eating this thing will make you ceremonially unclean in my sight, and this will make you clean. And so he gives them all those things. Not only then does he give them that set of laws, which we call ceremonial laws, but he also gives them civic laws. You're going to be this new nation. And so now here's all of the laws that you're going to use as the foundation for how to live together when you enter into the promised land. And so he gives them legal laws, civic laws to bind the way that they live. And so a lot of the times theologians, when they look at I think it's 513. I always forget. I think it's 513 laws that God gives the Israelites. At least that's the traditional way of counting them. It's either that or 613. I forget. 513, I think. And we look at all those laws, and the way that theologians oftentimes will categorize them is they'll say there's moral laws. These are laws where God is simply saying this is how he expects all people to relate to him and to approach him as someone that desires to be in God's presence. And so we would put the 10 commandments into there. Then there's ceremonial laws or religious laws, and then civil laws. So this is just a simple way of kind of thinking about what we've got going on in the heart of the Old Testament, there being this nation of Israel and the sacrificial plan. And I'll get you in a second here, Ken. I'm just going to explain this diagram here. So on the one hand, we've got Adam's one-way covenant. This is God just promising to people, I'm going to do this for you. And there's nothing you need to do back, right? Just trust me. I'm going to take care of things. And that begins with the promise to Adam and Eve. At the very beginning, we see that then being added to by Abraham. And we're going to see a little bit more getting added on Mount Sinai here. And that continues all the way to the end of time. But there's something special going on Mount Sinai as well, where there's this two-way covenant that's being made, where God says, I want you Israelites to do these ceremonial things. I want you to live in a very special way and to be my special people. And in doing that, you're going to then preserve my revelation to the world, including the promise of this one-way covenant. And you need to do these things. If you stop doing these things, if you stop being the vessel that I need here on earth to contain my revelation and my gospel message, then the Assyrians and the Babylonians and stuff, they're going to come, right? But so this is a temporary two-way covenant that God makes with the people of Israel. When the New Testament comes around, then that covenant is done away with. And we then find the new Jewish Christians at that time saying, guess what? The children of Israel, it's not limited to just those born from the blood of Israel. It's anyone that trusts in that gospel promise that Israel preserved. Good comments. So we got these two covenants. Adam's covenant, then, this is the covenant that we mean when we talk about the gospel, where we're tracking all of those threads throughout history. They all tie up into this one-way covenant of Adam's. But on Mount Sinai, we also have this two-way covenant that's being established. So after getting the 10 Commandments up there on the mountain, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. So not only do we have this mountain being consecrated, and if you cross the boundaries without God's personal invitation and consecration, you die, but we've got earthquakes and lightning and all this kind of stuff going on at the top of the mountain as well. And how did the people respond? In the exact opposite way as how we began this thing, right? Sometimes we're asking, why doesn't God show himself more? Now we've got the Israelites saying, God, you're showing yourself too much. We need someone to go in between, because we are just too terrified of this God that we find. So here's the question. Why are the Israelites so terrified to be in the presence of God in their terror? What do the Israelites ask for? So the first thing, we've kind of explored this already a bit. So I'll just kind of mention some of the things we've talked about, right? God is holy, and his holiness consumes unholiness. That's what it means to be holy. That's what it means to be righteous, is to consume unrighteousness. So God made the requirements of his holiness clear. What did Moses just come down with? The 10 Commandments, right? Made it as clear as day, the requirements for approaching this holy and this righteous God. And no one can keep these commandments perfectly. There is no one that has what it takes to be in the presence of a holy and righteous God. And so what do the Israelites ask for? This is a very interesting thing. They ask for what we call a mediator. They ask for someone that can go between God and them, someone that can be that mouthpiece and that representative to God for them, right? And right now they're asking Moses to be that mediator. So very kind of interesting stuff going on here on the top of Mount Sinai. So they're there for a long time at Mount Sinai as Moses continues to go up and down. And at one point, God speaks through Moses, and he says this to the people: the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him, for this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb. Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. That's just another name for the mountain that they're asked. On the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, or we will die. So the Israelites are saying, we do not want to be this close to God. And so what's God's response to it? He not only gives them Moses for a short period of time to be their mediator, but now what's God doing? He's promising another mediator. He's promising another prophet. The Lord said to me, what they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. If anyone does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. And so here we've got something interesting going on, this promise that God is making. And it is a promise that's not just, I'm going to send prophets, little p, in general. Here, God is promising what we might call a capital P prophet, a very special kind of prophet that's going to come. So since the people have asked for a mediator, God promises to send one. What details does God give us regarding this mediator? So what do you see there? What kind of details do we have? Who will the mediator come out of? Yeah, from among their brothers, right? So somehow this is going to be a mediator that's going to come out of the people of Israel themselves. Good, right? He will be an Israelite. What else do we have here? What other details?
God will put his words in his mouth.
Yeah, right. And so every prophet that is doing the right thing is speaking words that God has put into his mouth. That's what it means to prophesy. When we think of the term prophecy, what we usually think of is this idea of telling the future, that God puts into the mind of a prophet what the future is going to be like, and then the prophet tells us. That's one very small part of what prophets do. To be a prophet simply means God tells you something, and then you tell other people what God has said. And so we've got that here, right? God is going to put his words into the mouth of the prophet. But there's a very kind of special emphasis to it, right? That this is almost in a way not like just a generic, normal, ordinary prophet that God uses, but a very special way that God is going to put these words in his mouth. Really emphasizes that, right? Good. What else?
It's Marion. God says if you don't listen to this prophet, then he will call you or me to account for not listening.
Right. So when God speaks, these are the words of life. You reject those words of life. You reject the words that the prophet speaks, and you're rejecting God, right? And you're going to be called to account. Good. What else? Did I hear someone? What else do we got here? There's one other kind of big point here. What's interesting is he says this is going to be another prophet like Moses, right? This is going to be like me. How is Moses special compared to all the other prophets of the Old Testament? Just thinking back on the other Old Testaments, how is Moses different? In fact, that's the place we're going to go to next, right? So we've got a prophet like Moses, right? There's not going to be another prophet like Moses in his direct face-to-face mediation with God until Jesus arrives. It's going to be a prophet from among your own brothers, so a fellow Israelite. God will put his words in the prophet's mouth, a very kind of special emphasis there. But as you think back, how was Moses different from all other Old Testament prophets?
God speaks directly to him. He speaks directly to God.
Yeah, can you think of any other prophet where, God makes his presence on the top of a mountain top that if anyone steps near it without his invitation, they die. And this prophet then, he's just going back and forth into the presence of God and out, and back into the presence and out, right? So we've got a very special type of relationship between Moses and God here, right? Good. Other thoughts? How is Moses different? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know, but
Kathy?
he also was raised, he wasn't raised with his mother. He was raised, in the house.
Okay, yeah, so he's definitely got a unique kind of a story that goes along with him. I'm going to let Heather in here real quick. It's my Yep. So he's got definitely a different kind of background. I don't know if that's specifically, though, what he's talking about here, right? But Moses, yeah, he comes from royalty, then he gets kicked out, and then he comes back to that royal family and tells the children of Israel that they need to go. What else, though? What does Moses receive in a special way that no other prophet does? What's he get on that mountaintop? Yeah, the 10 Commandments, as well as those other 500 laws, right? So we've got the receiver of this new covenant, which is going to shape God's special people, the Israelites, for 1,000 years to come, 1,400 years to come. So we've got a very special type of individual that's taking place here. And here we're saying that this person is going to be like Moses. So in what sense is this person going to be like Moses? Perhaps he's going to interface with God in a very special way, right? Face to face with God, maybe in a very special way. Maybe this prophet is going to have something to do with the covenants of God, right? And I say covenant, and maybe you hear that phrase that you hear every time we have communion in church, which is what? When the sacraments are consecrated. Can you recall? When Jesus consecrates the sacrament on the Last Supper, and what does he say? This body and blood are a new, all right, thank you, right? A new covenant, right? So maybe there's something going on here with this new covenant, right, thing as well, or the idea that this prophet establishes a new covenant, right? Moses uniquely interfaced with God, regularly dwelling in the presence of God. He also was the establisher of a covenant that all prophets built upon. And so why can't Moses be the ultimate prophet that Israel needs? What's going to happen to Moses? He's going to die,
He's gonna
right?
die.
Yeah, right. So this is not going to be some type of permanent mediator. And what do humans need? Humanity needs a permanent person between us and God for now, right? Someone that's going to come and mediate in a very special way. Someone who can permanently be our go-between and speaking for God. So with all that, we're not going to completely show how all of these things, all these promises were kept yet. We're going to take an entire lesson in the future to show how this promised mediator came, how God kept this promise. But just as a little bit of a hint, 1,500 years later, there's going to be this guy named John the Baptist. And John the Baptist, as he is preaching, and he's preaching his thing of repentance and baptizing people, and he's saying he's preparing this way of some sort, he's going to be questioned. And as he gets questioned, one of the questions that are going to be asked of him is the Pharisees are going to ask, are you the prophet, with a capital P? Okay, at least the way we translate is with a capital P. There's a specific the prophet that the Israelites have been waiting for 1,500 years for. And they asked John the Baptist, are you this prophet? And he says, nope, I'm not that prophet. But what's interesting is that the prophet is there among them, that he has come. And John's job is to ultimately point the way to this capital P prophet, this very special mediator that God promised 1,500 years earlier on Mount Sinai to send to the Israelites. And so that's what we're going to, so next week then we'll turn and we'll look at another aspect. At the heart of the way that especially Lutherans, but other church bodies think about the roles that Christ fulfilled as our Messiah, there's often this idea of the prophet, priest, and king, okay? And this is where we begin the discussion of Jesus coming as a very special type of prophet, that there was an expectation for a prophet that was set 1,500 years later. And in the next few lessons, we'll turn and see how there was an expectation for a priest to come and a king to come as well, very special priests and kings. And then we'll ultimately, finally be able to see how Jesus fulfilled all of those roles.